Everything, from the clothes on your back to the car in your driveway, depends on a global trade system so efficient most people never notice it exists, and so vulnerable that one rogue actor could dismantle the entire thing. While planes, trains, and automobiles all facilitate the flow of goods, the true goat of global logistics is ships. Cargo freighters make it affordable for an American tech company to sell a product assembled in China, built with components from Vietnam, constructed using minerals mined in Canada. Without the humble freighter, the global economy doesn't slow down. It collapses. Last year, roughly $14 trillion worth of goods were shipped worldwide. Around 80% of that was moved by sea. This is where the danger is. Transcontinental maritime trade, to the scale we rely on, only can exist because of a few narrow passages. The Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Strait of Malacca. Control those routes, and you control the global economy. Industrial agriculture and consumer electronics alike depend on these narrow waterways. Access to these routes is essential for any industrial economy. Under the American-led world order, there was an equilibrium. Every power understood who owned the routes on paper, and every power understood who had the most influence over them. But that balance is breaking. Thanks to climate change, an externality nobody planned for, but everyone is now exploiting, the Arctic is opening. Two routes once written off as an imperial delusion are becoming viable: the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route. The Northwest Passage cuts through the Canadian archipelago. The Northern Sea Route hugs the Eurasian Arctic coast. Both connect the Atlantic to the Pacific, and both shave off thousands of kilometers between some of the world's most developed markets. Their emergence threatens to undermine existing chokepoints, weaken traditional maritime powers, and shift control of global commerce northward. This is not an environmental story. It's a power transition. And it's making people nervous. Geopolitical landscapes are shifting. The world is heating up. The winners and losers of a new trade order are making their opening moves. This is the Arctic of the 21st century, and it's heavily contested. For centuries, the Northwest Passage and Northern Sea Route were imperial fantasies. To the British and Russian empires, they offered security in an era where maritime trade meant months at sea and massive financial risk. Arctic routes promise speed, leverage, and dominance over Asian markets via uncontested routes not shared with any of their rivals. As Russia absorbed Siberia and Britain consolidated control across North America, obsession replaced caution. Both empires believed these passages could anchor a global trade network that would lock them into permanent relevance. They were wrong. Ice, weather, and technological limits turned theory into tragedy. Ships were crushed, crews froze, entire expeditions vanished. Still, neither empire knew when to quit. Then came the canals. Suez in 1869, Panama in 1914. Overnight, the Arctic routes became commercially irrelevant. The Northern Sea Route saw limited Soviet use in the 1930s. The Northwest Passage would not host a modern commercial transit until 2013. For most of the 20th century, both were dismissed as historical curiosities. The world moved on. And then, the ice started melting. Today, Arctic navigation is longer, more predictable, and increasingly viable without constant icebreaker support. The empires that dreamed of these routes are gone, but the incentives that drove them are very much alive, and a new set of players are now looking to capitalize on the routes. Russia, China, the United States, Canada, and the European Union. All of them see the same thing. Shorter routes, lower costs, less dependence on choke points controlled by someone else. The fantasy didn't die. It just waited for the climate to cooperate. The modern Arctic is often sold as a space for cooperation. That's marketing, a blatant, albeit aspirational lie. In reality, it's an unstable mix of overlapping claims, military posturing, and quietly escalating competition. Russia treats the Northern Sea Route as a domestic artery, enforcing transit rules and backing them with icebreakers and military infrastructure. China calls itself a near-Arctic state, a term that sounds absurd until you realize how much of its economy depends on uninterrupted shipping. The Northwest Passage and Northern Sea Route offer China faster access to Europe and reduced exposure to US-controlled maritime chokepoints. Losing access to either would be economically painful. The United States has publicly supported cooperative Arctic governance, but that commitment seems to weaken when cooperation doesn't translate to control. Threats towards Greenland, dismissive language around Canadian sovereignty, and growing military interest in the region suggest Washington is far less interested in shared management than it lets on. If the US were to secure effective control over Greenland, it wouldn't just gain a strategic outpost. It would gain leverage over who can realistically use the Northwest Passage. And that exposes the lie at the heart of global trade. Shipping routes aren't neutral, they're political weapons. As the Arctic opens, the question isn't whether global commerce will change. It's whether the world is trading one set of gatekeepers for another, and whether anyone outside of the great powers get a say. The future for these two sea routes are uncertain. Assuming the geopolitical climate stays the same, we will see quiet development at first. As a trickle of ships becomes a flood, resource extraction will follow. Corporations will see untapped oil, gas, and minerals, all on a convenient shipping lane. This proximity to infrastructure will make Arctic development look more lucrative than ever before. What the railway did for the development of the western United States, the Northern Sea Route and Northwest Passage will do to the Arctic. Port cities along the route, from Arctic staging points like Anchorage and Vladivostok to global hubs like Shanghai and Vancouver, will reach capacity, requiring new infrastructure and expansions to match the rapidly increasing demand. Secondary ports like Seattle and Tianjin will expand as jurisdictions compete to secure material gains and capture spillover from the major hubs. The declining importance of the Panama Canal and Suez Canal will threaten vital revenue streams for the Panamanian and Egyptian governments. This will also affect the international and corporate investors who own infrastructure around each waterway. They stand to lose billions. The focus on global commerce moves from the equator to the Arctic, just as it has shifted between oceans in previous centuries. Shifts like this are inherently destabilizing, and some of the flashpoints they create are big enough to start wars. The Bering Strait is the only gateway between the Arctic and the Pacific, and it's bordered by giants. Russia and the United States have experienced serious fractures in their relationship. Mistrust lends itself to miscommunication and miscalculation. Miscommunication and miscalculation between superpowers is not a triviality. It is a costly and dangerous mistake. Another flashpoint is access. For China, Russia, the EU, and the United States, access is not optional. If NATO bans Chinese ships from using the passage for trade with sanctioned countries, or Russia bans US ships from the Northern Sea Route, it would create the kind of tension that doesn't stay contained for long. And then there is the mineral and oil wealth. Trillions in undeveloped assets beneath a layer of permafrost. The economic potential of the Arctic is more than the waterways alone. It is Earth's final frontier. A frontier that every corporation and state on the planet will be eager to exploit. A frontier so rich that wars stop looking implausible and start looking inevitable. This is the state of the Arctic in the 21st century. Not a serene environment harsh enough to keep out industrial civilization, but a warming frontier, becoming increasingly acclimatized to serving the ambitions of empires. Everything from the clothes on your back to the car in your driveway depends on a global trade system so efficient most people never notice it, and so powerful that a superpower would stake it all just to control it. The Arctic is no longer a frozen backwater. It's a battleground for trade, resources, and influence. The prize is enormous. The cost, ecological collapse, threatened sovereignty, and the constant risk of escalation. Do you think it's worth it? Let me know in the comments. Please like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.